She threw his medical degree into the fireplace and laughed as the flames took it. She told him he was nothing, a broke, embarrassing failure she had wasted her best years on. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined in her cruelest dreams, was that the man she was humiliating had just become one of the wealthiest people on the entire planet. What would you have done if the person who destroyed your dignity turned out to be standing on ground that belonged entirely to you? Stay with me, because this story is about to show you exactly what quiet power looks like when it finally decides to speak. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Are you tuning in from London, Lagos, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where this community reaches. Now, let us begin. Daniel Osei had the kind of face that people forgot. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because he never demanded to be remembered. He moved through rooms quietly, spoke when spoken to, and had spent the better part of 12 years making himself as small and unobtrusive as possible inside the home he shared with his wife, Vivienne, and her family's suffocating orbit of expectation. He was a doctor, or rather he had been. He had earned his degree after 7 grueling years of study and sacrifice, working night shifts at a convenience store to fund his tuition, while his peers went to house parties and slept through their 20s. Medicine had not been a dream handed to him. It had been a mountain he climbed with bare, bleeding hands, and he had made it to the top. The trouble was that Vivienne had never been impressed by the climb. She was only ever interested in the view. And in her estimation, Daniel's view was never elevated enough. Vivienne Hartley Osei came from a family that treated wealth the way other families treated religion, with devotion, ceremony, and a fierce intolerance for apostasy. Her mother, Constance Hartley, was a woman whose entire personality had calcified around the single belief that social standing was the only currency that truly mattered. Her brother, Preston Hartley, was a financial consultant who had coasted on family connections his entire career and had the arrogance of a man who had never once been told no. Daniel had married Vivienne when he was 29 and she was 27. He had been naive enough to believe that love was the thing that mattered. She had been calculating enough to believe that a doctor's salary was a reasonable starting point, though her ambitions had always aimed far higher. The first years were not entirely without warmth. But warmth in the Hartley family's presence was a luxury that got steadily more expensive. By the time Daniel and Vivienne were in their mid-30s, the temperature inside their marriage had dropped to something close to freezing. Constance had decided early on that Daniel was beneath her daughter. He was from a modest background. His parents had been teachers in a small city she had never bothered to learn the name of. He did not golf. He did not summer anywhere. He drove a sensible car and packed his own lunch, and Constance treated these facts as evidence of a character deficiency rather than a philosophy. She made her feelings known in small, consistent ways that were designed to erode rather than confront. She would compliment Vivienne's appearance, and then let her gaze drift to Daniel with an expression of polite disappointment. She referred to his medical practice as that little clinic, despite the fact that it served over 2,000 patients and had been rated among the top primary care practices in the county 3 years running. At Christmas gatherings, Constance would ask Daniel about his work in the tone a person uses when asking a child about a school project. Curious enough to be polite, dismissive enough to make clear that the answer did not matter. She once asked him, in front of a table of 12 people, whether he had ever considered going back to school. He was a licensed physician. He had been licensed for nearly a decade at the point she asked. The table had gone briefly quiet, and then Constance had pivoted smoothly to a different subject, as though the question had been entirely innocent. Daniel had answered without visible distress. He had learned early on that the safest response to Constance's provocations was a short, calm reply that gave her nothing to escalate from. She disliked this. She would have preferred either capitulation or open hurt, both of which could have been weaponized. His refusal to perform either had become, over the years, one of the small, private acts of resistance that kept him standing. Preston was worse, because he was younger and less subtle. He called Daniel the charity case behind his back, occasionally to his face, and once, at a dinner party that Daniel would never forget, had announced to the table that it was sweet that Vivian had chosen to experience life with someone real before presumably upgrading. The word upgrading had landed in the room with a certain casual confidence, the confidence of a man who has never once been made to account for a single thing he has said. Daniel had looked down at his plate and said nothing. Vivian had laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That was almost worse. It was the easy, social laugh of someone who has chosen, in a moment of small consequence, which side of a table they are sitting on. She had not looked at Daniel after it escaped her. She had picked up her wine glass and said something to Preston's wife, redirecting the conversation with practiced ease. But the laugh was there, in the air of the room, for the rest of the evening. That laugh had carved something out of Daniel that never quite grew back. But he stayed. He stayed because he believed in commitment, because he was not by nature a man who quit, and because somewhere beneath the humiliation he still loved the woman Vivienne had once been, or perhaps the woman he had once believed she was. He stayed through 5 more years of it. 5 more years of Constance's theatrical sighs and Preston's casual contempt. 5 more years of Vivian coming home from family dinners, slightly more dismissive than when she had left, as though her mother had been steadily convincing her of something Daniel could not quite identify. Then came the night of his father's funeral. Kofi Osei had died at 73 quietly, in the way that good men sometimes do. He had been a mathematics teacher for 4 decades. He had raised Daniel alone after Daniel's mother passed when Daniel was 11. He had worked every single day of his adult life without complaint and without recognition, and he had left behind a small house, a large library, and a son who missed him with an ache that had no bottom. The funeral was held on a Thursday. It was raining. Daniel had driven 3 hours to his hometown and stood at the graveside in a black coat that was slightly too thin for the weather because he had not thought to check the forecast. He had been too busy notifying patients, rescheduling appointments, arranging the service, and doing all the logistical work of grief that nobody warns you about. Vivienne had come. He had to give her that. She had come, but she had brought her mother, and Constance had worn an expression of barely concealed impatience throughout the service, as though she were attending an obligation rather than a burial. Afterward, at the small reception held in the community hall near the church, Constance had pulled Vivian aside in a way that was not quite private enough. Daniel had been standing near the drinks table, accepting condolences from his father's former students, when he heard his mother-in-law's voice cut through the murmur of the room like a blade through paper. "I don't know why you're still doing this," Constance said. "Your father and I have been talking. Preston has found someone for you, someone appropriate. This whole situation has gone on long enough." Daniel did not turn around. He accepted another handshake. He thanked another former student of his father's. He stood very still and listened to his wife consider the proposition in silence that lasted just a few seconds too long. "Mother," Vivienne finally said, and her voice was not the voice of a woman defending her husband. It was the voice of a woman who had already made up her mind and was simply managing the timing. He drove home alone that night. Vivienne stayed to help her mother with arrangements, though there were no arrangements that required her presence. He understood by the time he pulled into the driveway of their house that the marriage was ending. He simply did not yet know how it would be done to him. He found out 8 days later. He came home from a 14-hour shift at the clinic to find Vivienne in the living room with Preston and a man he did not recognize, young, well-dressed, with the particular ease of someone who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. His name was Marcus Elroy. He was, Preston explained with visible satisfaction, a property developer. He had recently acquired a portfolio worth $40 million. He was exactly the kind of man the Hartley family had always wanted for Vivienne. Marcus Elroy was also, it was immediately clear, already Vivienne's boyfriend. "We need to talk," Vivienne said. What followed was not a conversation. It was a verdict. Vivienne had spoken to a lawyer. She wanted the house, their house, the one Daniel had made the down payment on with his savings, the joint accounts, and what she termed compensation for the years I spent being held back by this relationship. She said these things in a flat, administrative tone, as though she were reciting items from a list she had rehearsed. Preston leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and a small smile on his face. Marcus Elroy examined his phone. Daniel asked, quietly, if they could speak privately. Vivienne said there was nothing to discuss privately. Everything, she said, had already been decided. And then she said the thing that Daniel would carry with him for a long time afterward. She looked at him with something that was not quite contempt. Contempt, at least, would have required caring. And she said, "You were never going to be enough, Daniel. That's not something you can fix." He did not respond. There was nothing to say to that. He nodded once, turned, and walked to his study. Behind him, he heard Preston say something low and amused, and heard Vivienne and Marcus laugh together. In the study, on the shelf above his desk, was the framed copy of his medical degree. He had hung it there himself on the day they moved in, with a small sense of pride he had tried not to show. It was the first thing he had put on the wall of any home he had ever occupied. He had stood back and looked at it for a moment before Vivienne called him from another room, and he had allowed himself briefly the private knowledge that the piece of paper meant something. Not for its market value, not for what it said about him to anyone else, but for what it had cost him to earn, and for the man he had been becoming when he earned it. He heard the door open behind him. He assumed it was Vivienne, coming to say something else. It was not Vivienne. It was Vivienne holding the frame. She had taken it from the shelf without his noticing, while his back was turned. She walked past him to the fireplace, which was lit against the autumn chill, and she held the frame over the flames for a moment, a deliberate, theatrical pause designed to make sure he was watching. And then she let it go. The glass cracked from the heat. The parchment caught slowly, then faster. "You can keep that," she said. "Consider it a parting gift." She walked out. He heard the three of them leave together. He heard the front door close. He heard the sound of Marcus's expensive car receding down the street, the engine note of a man who had somewhere better to be. Daniel stood in the study and watched his degree burn. The smoke rose in a thin, grey line. The parchment curled and darkened. The name printed on it, his name, the one his father had given him, was gone in less than a minute. And then he sat down in his chair, folded his hands in his lap, and thought about his father. There was an envelope. He had almost missed it. In the chaos of arranging the funeral, dealing with his father's modest estate, and managing the slow collapse of his marriage, he had carried the envelope around for almost 2 weeks without opening it. His father's lawyer, a quiet, meticulous man named Solomon Addo, who had handled Kofi Ose's affairs for 30 years, had pressed it into Daniel's hand at the reception after the burial and said, "Not urgent, but important. Open it when you have a clear head." Daniel had not had a clear head since. But the night Vivian burned his degree, after the house emptied and the fire died down to coals, he found the envelope in his coat pocket. It was thick, heavier than a simple letter. He opened it. Inside was a handwritten note from his father, 2 pages long, in Kofi's careful schoolteacher's script. And beneath the note were documents, formal documents, dense with legal language, bearing the letterheads of institutions Daniel did not immediately recognize. He read the note first. His father had written it 3 years earlier, during an illness that had since resolved but had apparently prompted Kofi to put certain things in order. The letter was not sentimental, it was precise, methodical, and organized like a lesson plan, which was, Daniel understood, the only way his father had ever known to express love. Kofi explained that for most of Daniel's life, there had been a matter he had not known how to discuss. He had grown up poor, he had lived poor, he had taught poor. But during his early 20s, before Daniel was born, he had done something that turned out to matter enormously. He had purchased land. It had been a small parcel inherited from his own father, who had received it as a land grant decades earlier. It was in a region that had, at the time, seemed remote and economically marginal. Kofi had paid the taxes on it every year without fail, not out of any speculative ambition, but out of a stubborn conviction that a man should keep what was his. He had never sold it. He had never spoken of it. He had simply kept it, year after year, decade after decade, as the world changed around it. The world had changed considerably. What had once been marginal land was now at the center of one of the fastest-growing economic corridors in the region. A series of infrastructure projects, a highway expansion, a new port development, a logistics hub, had converged on that area over the previous 15 years, transforming the land's value in ways that even professional appraisers had found difficult to calculate with a straight face. Kofi had retained Solomon Addo to manage the asset quietly and to protect it from any opportunistic acquisition attempts over the years. Solomon had done this with extraordinary competence, navigating rezoning proposals, buyout offers from development companies, and the occasional aggressive approach from parties who had not understood that Kofi Ose was not a man who could be pressured. The documents in the envelope were the complete record of the asset. The title, in Kofi's name, with a notarized inheritance clause transferring sole ownership to Daniel upon his father's death. The valuation reports, the correspondence with development companies, the most recent offer, from a consortium of international infrastructure investors, that Solomon had declined on Kofi's behalf pending Daniel's decision. The offer was for $22 billion. Daniel read that number 3 times. Then he set the papers down on the desk very carefully and looked at the cold ashes in the fireplace where his degree had been. He sat with this information for a very long time. He called Solomon Addo the next morning at 7 o'clock. Solomon answered on the second ring, as though he had been expecting the call. "You read the letter?" Solomon said. "I read the letter," Daniel confirmed. "How are you feeling?" Daniel considered the question. "Like I need to understand everything," he said. "All of it. From the beginning." "Then come to my office," Solomon said. "Bring nothing. Tell no one. I'll have everything ready." Daniel drove 4 hours to Solomon's office in the city where his father had grown up. The office was on the 3rd floor of a building that appeared completely unremarkable from the outside. Deliberately so, Solomon would later explain. He had learned long ago that the most important conversations happened in rooms that did not advertise themselves. Solomon was 71 years old, lean, with close-cropped white hair, and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything. He had been Kofi Osei's lawyer, his confidant, and in many ways his strategist for 3 decades. He had a way of speaking that reminded Daniel of his father, precise, never wasteful with words, delivering difficult information in the same register as simple information, because he believed that how a truth was delivered shaped how it was received. He had watched the land's value grow with the patience of someone who had been told from the beginning that patience was the only tool required. He laid everything out on a wide table, maps showing the land's position relative to the new infrastructure projects, valuation reports from 4 independent firms, legal documents confirming Daniel's sole and uncontested ownership, and a folder containing the most recent correspondence from the Infrastructure Consortium, a group of European and Asian institutional investors who had been trying, through various intermediaries, to acquire the land for almost 2 years. They had not been told who owned it. They had been told only that the owner was considering their offer. Solomon had managed this with the same meticulous discretion he had brought to everything. "The 22 billion, Daniel said, is that real?" "It is the current offer," Solomon said. "In my professional opinion, given the trajectory of the development projects and the strategic value of the location, it may not be the ceiling." Daniel looked at the map. His father's land. Paid for with money Kofi had scraped together before Daniel was born, kept alive with annual tax payments for 4 decades, protected quietly by a meticulous old lawyer who had never breathed a word. "Why didn't he tell me?" Daniel asked. Solomon was quiet for a moment. "He was afraid," he said finally. "Not for himself, for you. He watched you build your life from nothing, the way he had, and he believed that if you knew about this, it might change the way you built it. He wanted you to be the man you are before you knew what you had." Daniel thought about that. He thought about 14-hour shifts and packed lunches and driving a sensible car and being called the charity case at family dinners. "He was right," Daniel said. They spent 6 hours in that office. Solomon walked him through every legal structure, every protection, every option available to him. The ownership was airtight. There were no creditors, no encumbrances, no outstanding claims. The land was his, free and clear, in a way that was as close to absolute as property law allowed. And then Daniel told Solomon about Vivienne. He told him about the divorce proceedings, about the house, the joint accounts, the demand for compensation. He told him about Preston and Marcus Elroy, and the way his wife had stood in front of the fireplace and let his degree burn. Solomon listened without expression. When Daniel finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She has filed for divorce?" he asked. "She says she has spoken to a lawyer," Daniel said. "The papers have not arrived yet." "Then," Solomon said, "we have some time. And there are certain things we should discuss about the structure of your assets before those papers are served." Daniel looked at him. "Tell me," he said. Solomon smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting 30 years to have this conversation. The next 4 weeks were the quietest of Daniel's life. He went to work. He saw his patients. He answered Vivian's lawyer's letters with the calm, brief replies of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fight about. He moved into a furnished apartment with a view of a parking lot and a kitchen that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking, and he lived there without complaint. He did not tell anyone what he knew, not a colleague, not a friend, certainly not anyone connected to Vivian or her family. Underneath the stillness, things were moving. Solomon had spent 30 years protecting the asset with a precision that extended now to the divorce proceedings. The land's ownership structure had been maintained since Kofi's original acquisition in a way that placed it entirely outside the reach of any marital claim. Daniel had never used it as collateral. It had never appeared on any joint financial document. It was, for all practical and legal purposes, as invisible to the divorce as a painting locked in a vault on another continent. But invisibility, Solomon explained, was only one of the tools available to them. The other tool was information. During the discovery phase of the divorce proceedings, Vivian's lawyer had submitted standard financial disclosure documents. Daniel's team, led by Solomon, and a forensic accountant named Grace Park, who had been recommended by a colleague of Solomon's, reviewed those documents with a care that Vivian's side had clearly not anticipated. What they found was interesting. Preston Hartley, Vivian's brother, had been managing a portion of the Hartley family's investment portfolio for the previous 8 years. He had done so through a consulting firm that was, in name, an independent entity, but was, in practice, entirely funded by the Hartley family and operated primarily for their benefit. This arrangement was not, on its face, illegal. However, Grace Park had noticed certain patterns in the transactions that suggested Preston had been moving money in ways that were not entirely consistent with his client's stated interests, including, on several occasions, the interests of Vivian herself. She had been a beneficiary of some of those investment accounts. The documentation was complex, but in the end, clear enough. Preston had been quietly enriching himself at the expense of the very family members he was nominally serving, including his sister, including his mother. They had trusted him entirely, and he had used that trust the way he used most things as a resource to be extracted. Grace Park summarized her findings in a 40-page report that she delivered to Solomon on a Tuesday afternoon. Solomon read it twice, then called Daniel. "Read page 23, he said. Daniel read page 23. "This is going to the relevant authorities," Solomon said, "not as an act of vengeance, as a legal and ethical obligation. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Good, because what happens next will happen regardless of your wishes. The evidence is too clear to ignore. The question is only whether we present it proactively or allow it to emerge during discovery in a way we cannot control." "Present it proactively," Daniel said. Solomon made the calls. Vivian's lawyer received a letter on a Friday. It was brief, professional, and utterly devastating in its implications. It outlined, in precise legal language, Daniel's position on the division of assets. It noted, with appropriate citation of relevant statutes, that the marital estate did not include certain assets that had never formed part of the marital estate, and that had always been and remained solely the property of Daniel Osei. It also noted, with careful and specific reference to the documentation Grace Park had assembled, that certain financial irregularities in the Hartley family's investment accounts had been referred to the appropriate regulatory bodies, and that Vivian herself might wish to seek independent counsel regarding her own potential exposure as a beneficiary of those accounts. It was signed by Solomon Addo and 4 co-counsel, 2 of whom were among the most prominent names in financial and property law in the country. Vivian received a copy. Daniel was told later that she read it standing in her kitchen. He was told that she had to read it twice. He was told that after the second reading, she sat down on the floor. He felt nothing particular upon hearing this. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel cruelty. He felt primarily the absence of something, the particular weight of the previous 12 years, as though the letter had functioned not as a weapon, but as a key, unlocking a door he had not been able to open from the inside. The regulatory referral moved faster than anyone expected. Preston Hartley's consulting firm came under scrutiny from financial regulators within 3 weeks of the referral. The investigators were thorough in the way that financial regulators become thorough when they are given well-organized documentation by credible sources. They did not need to do much digging. The evidence, as Grace Park had organized it, was practically a roadmap. Every irregular transaction was dated, sourced, cross-referenced, with corresponding client statements. There were no ambiguous grey areas. Grace Park had not done her work in grey areas. Preston was suspended from practicing as a financial consultant within 6 weeks. His firm's accounts were frozen pending investigation. His professional reputation, which had always been built more on bluster and family connection than on genuine expertise, collapsed with a speed that suggested it had never been particularly stable to begin with. Within 2 months, 3 separate clients had retained their own lawyers. Within 4 months, the initial investigation had expanded in scope. Within 6, Preston was facing charges that made suspended look like the optimistic part of his situation. Constance Hartley, who had invested a significant portion of her own savings through Preston's firm, found herself in the deeply uncomfortable position of being both the architect of her son's career and one of his victims. She had pushed Preston forward for every opportunity. She had made the calls, opened the doors, leveraged every social connection she possessed to install him in rooms he would not otherwise have been allowed to enter. And he had used the access she provided to quietly help himself to funds that should not have been his to touch. The family's financial standing, which had always been somewhat less impressive than Constance's manner implied, proved under scrutiny to be considerably more fragile than anyone outside the family had known. The large house, the curated social calendar, the expensive vacations posted with steady frequency on social media, all of it had been sustained by a structure that was now cracking from every angle. The Hartley family's social circle was not a forgiving environment. Their standing in it had always depended on the appearance of effortless wealth and competence. The appearance had dissolved remarkably quickly once the reality began to surface in financial news and, inevitably, in the kind of whispered conversations that circulate in the particular social world the Hartleys had spent their lives cultivating. People who had accepted their invitations stopped extending their own. Constance found herself sitting in restaurants she had previously considered beneath her, because the ones she had frequented for 20 years had stopped feeling like safe territory. Marcus Elroy, as it turned out, was less interested in Vivian the person than in Vivian the asset. When the financial irregularities became public and Vivian's own accounts were temporarily frozen pending the investigation into her status as a beneficiary, Marcus's interest in the relationship cooled with a speed that even Vivian, for all her practiced cynicism, seemed not to have anticipated. He did not call, he did not send a message, he simply stopped appearing. Vivian called Daniel. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to the message once. She did not ask for help. She did not apologize. She asked, in a voice that was trying to be commanding and achieving only something thin and brittle, whether he could clarify his position on the ongoing proceedings. He did not return the call. His lawyers did. The divorce was finalized in a settlement that was, by any measure, a humiliation for Vivian's original position. She received what she was entitled to from the marital estate, a fair and legally determined share of the assets that had been jointly held. She did not receive the house. She did not receive compensation. She did not receive anything that was not directly and explicitly hers under the law. The land, his father's land, Kofi's land, was never part of the discussion. Solomon had made certain of that before the proceedings began, and Vivian's lawyers, once they understood the legal structure they were dealing with, had not pushed the point. She also faced her own legal counsel over the question of her status as a beneficiary of Preston's accounts. That process was long, expensive, and ultimately resolved in a way that left her financially diminished and legally exhausted. She was not charged with wrongdoing. She had been a passive beneficiary, not a participant. But the legal costs and the reputational proximity to the scandal left her in a position very different from the one she had occupied when she stood in front of that fireplace. Preston faced criminal charges, 2 counts of financial fraud, 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. His lawyer negotiated a plea arrangement, and he served a sentence that the Hartley family's remaining social connections were unable to prevent or soften. He emerged from it broke, disbarred, and absent from the social landscape he had previously navigated with such careless ease. Constance Hartley sold her house. Not the large one she had maintained for decades as a symbol of the family's standing. That one was already gone. The smaller one she had moved into after the larger one became financially unmanageable. She sold that one too, eventually, to cover legal fees and outstanding debts. She moved into an apartment in a part of the city she had previously considered, beneath her consideration. Daniel knew these things because Solomon kept him informed of matters that were directly relevant to the legal proceedings. He did not seek out additional information. He did not follow the family's fortunes with any pleasure. What had happened because it was the legal and correct outcome of real events, and he felt about it the way a surgeon feels about the removal of something that had been causing damage, satisfied that it was done, uninterested in the details of the discarded matter. He agreed to one final meeting with Vivienne. Her lawyer had requested it. It was held in Solomon's office, which Vivienne had requested as a neutral venue, not understanding or not caring that the office represented the most complete expression of Daniel's position and power available. She arrived looking different from how he remembered her. Not diminished, exactly. The bearing was still there, the practiced composure. But something around the edges had loosened, and Daniel recognized it as the particular quality of a person who has been carrying a pretense for a long time and has recently had to set it down. They sat across from each other at the table where Daniel had first read his father's documents. The lawyers were present on both sides, but neither spoke immediately. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I know," he said. "About the land. About any of it. I know that too." She seemed to expect more from him, some expression of anger or grief or satisfaction. He felt none of those things. He felt primarily clarity. "You spent 12 years telling me in every way available to you that I was not enough," he said. His voice was even, conversational. "You told me with words. You told me by letting your family speak to me as though I were furniture. You told me the night of my father's funeral, when your mother talked about replacing me and you considered it. And you told me when you burned my degree and called it a parting gift." He paused. "What you did not know was that my father had spent 40 years building something on my behalf, not because he wanted to make me wealthy, because he wanted to make sure that if I was ever judged by people who only valued wealth, I could look at them and understand that their judgment was not the measure of my worth." Vivienne said nothing. "I don't want anything from you," he continued. "I don't want an apology. I don't want you to feel bad. What I want, what I have, is the understanding that my father was right. The people who tried to measure me were measuring with the wrong instrument." He stood. The lawyers gathered their papers. At the door, he turned back once. Not because he had something else to say, but because he wanted to look at her one more time from this particular vantage point, standing at the threshold of an office in which his name now carried a weight she could not have imagined, before he left and closed the chapter. She was still sitting at the table. She looked, for the first time in 12 years, exactly her age. He closed the door gently behind him. The consortium's offer was accepted 7 months after Daniel's first visit to Solomon's office. The transaction was handled with the same quiet precision that had characterized every step of the process. There were no press releases, no interviews, no announcements on any of the financial news platforms that track such things, because Daniel and Solomon had structured the agreement in a way that did not require public disclosure at the level of detail that would have made Daniel's name prominent. He did not want prominence. He had never wanted prominence. He wanted, as he told Solomon over a long dinner the evening the papers were signed, to live in a way that his father would have recognized. He kept the clinic. He had considered briefly whether the scale of what had happened required him to change his life completely, to step away from medicine and occupy himself with the management of an asset the size of a small nation's budget. He had decided against it quickly. The clinic was not what he did. It was, in the way that his father's classroom had been for Kofi, what he was. He hired an exceptional administrator to handle the operational side of the practice so that he could focus on patient care. He increased the number of subsidized appointments available to patients who could not afford full fees. He funded a bursary program at the university where he had earned his degree, the degree that had burned, for students from low-income backgrounds pursuing medicine. He bought a house, not a large one, a house with a garden and a study with good light and shelves that he filled slowly with his father's books, which he had kept in boxes since the estate was settled. He was one afternoon in the spring following the settlement, sitting in that garden when his phone rang. It was a friend, a fellow physician he had known since their residency, calling to catch up, and toward the end of the conversation to mention that she had a friend, a woman named Adesi, who was visiting the city for a conference, and who the friend thought Daniel might enjoy meeting. Daniel said he was not sure he was ready. His friend said, "You've been not ready for 12 years. You're ready." He met Adesi for coffee on a Tuesday. She was a researcher, infectious diseases, global health, who had the particular quality of someone who had spent their career thinking seriously about the world and had emerged from it not bitter, but more curious. She asked him real questions and listened to the actual answers. She laughed at things because they were funny, not because it was socially strategic. She mentioned in passing that she had driven a 15-year-old car for the previous decade because it still worked and she saw no reason to change it. He drove home afterward and sat in his study for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, feeling in a way he had almost forgotten was possible, entirely at ease. They saw each other again the following week, and the week after that. He did not tell her about the land or the settlement or any of it for several months. When he did, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Does it change anything for you?" "No," he said. "Good," she said, "because it doesn't change anything for me either." He believed her. He had learned by then the difference between people who valued him and people who had tried to value him at a price. There is an old leather-bound mathematics textbook on the shelf in Daniel's study. It was his father's, used for 30 years of teaching, its margins filled with Kofi's notes and corrections, and occasional small drawings, diagrams, patterns, the mathematical doodles of a man who thought in numbers and shapes. On the inside cover, in Kofi's careful script, is a line that Daniel read for the first time as a child and has read many times since. He does not know if his father wrote it himself or copied it from somewhere. It does not matter. It is true either way. It reads, The value of a thing is not changed by the ignorance of those who cannot see it. Vivian had stood in front of a fireplace and burned his degree. She had done it because she believed it was a symbol of the small, insufficient life she was leaving behind. She had not understood that the degree was paper and ink, and that what it represented had been built into the man who earned it 12 years before she put it to flame. She had not understood that burning a symbol changes nothing about the substance. His father had understood this. His father had spent 40 years sitting quietly on $22 billion and going to work every morning to teach algebra to teenagers, because he believed that the substance of a life was not its accumulated wealth, but its daily, consistent expression of character. Daniel Osei had learned that lesson in the way that the most important lessons are learned, not from instruction, but from example, not from comfort, but from watching someone he loved live it completely. The ashes in the fireplace had been cold for a long time. The study they had fallen in was no longer his, but the man who had stood and watched them fall was still entirely, exactly himself. And that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever mattered. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have confronted them sooner? Or would you have waited and let the truth do its work quietly? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories, and it means more than you know. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. There are more stories like this one coming, and I would love for you to be here for them. I will see you in the next video.